What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so before I get into this video, I want to give a shout out to the brother Eric Levin for the donation to the channel via the Cash App. And he had a question, and his question was, what if the 1988, 89, and 95 expansion was never done in the NBA? What if the expansions were not done? By that, I mean, and what he means is, what if the NBA never added those additional NBA franchises those respective years? Prior to the 88-89 season, the NBA added the Charlotte Hornets and the Miami Heat. Prior to the 89-90 season, they added the Orlando Magic and the Minnesota Timberwolves. And prior to the 95-96 season, the NBA added the then Vancouver Grizzlies and the Toronto Raptors. Now, of course, I think it was in 2002. I think it was 2002 when the Vancouver Grizzlies left Vancouver and went to Memphis. Now, this is kind of difficult to answer to me, in my opinion, because usually expansion happens when the league is thriving. And the NBA was thriving in the 80s. The NBA was thriving in the late 60s and early 1970s. Matter of fact, between 1965 and 1980, the NBA added, if I remember correctly, I believe it was the case, in that 15-year period, the NBA added 14 NBA franchises. In particular, between 1965 and 1972. So that tends to happen. Now, we have not had expansion in 20 years. The last team that was added was technically the Charlotte Bobcats, I believe. But, that's complicated because the Bobcats were once independent from the Pelicans, but then the Charlotte Bobcats ultimately became the Charlotte Hornets, and the Pelicans, who once were the Hornets, became independent of the Hornets and are now their own franchise, the New Orleans Pelicans. So, but anyway, let's try to answer this one. This is just my opinion. The first thing I think about is the players that were lost in the expansion draft. They would have been still on their respective teams. And I'm just going by the more prominent players. In the 88 expansion draft, for instance, Del Curry went from the Cavaliers to the Hornets. Muggsy Bogues went from the then Bullets to the Hornets. So if they were on their respective teams, those teams would be that much stronger. And, the trajectory of those franchises would have been different, or at least somewhat different, especially with the Bullets. In 89, Rick Mahorn, the Bad Boys lost him. He went to the Timberwolves. Reggie Theus was with the Atlanta Hawks, but they lost him in the expansion draft to the Orlando Magic. Terry Catlers was with the Bullets, but they lost him, and he went to the Orlando Magic, as you can see in this picture. I believe it's Terry Catlers right there. So you get where I'm going with this. There's Reggie Theus right there, number 24. So, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Scott Skiles was lost by, was it the Pacers? I think it was the Pacers to the Orlando Magic. So these teams lost some really, really good players. And in the mid 90s, of course, and I mean, you remember this, the Bulls lost B.J. Armstrong in the expansion draft. He went to, where did he go? I forgot where he went. I think he went to I think he went to the Raptors, but then they waived him or something. I forgot. Also, other players lost the expansion draft for that year were Byron Scott, Greg Anthony, John Sally, Gerald Wilkins. All right. So that's something to be said about how the added NBA franchises, these added NBA teams, they dilute the talent pool. And I'm not even talking about, some of the players that were drafted by these franchises in these respective years, right? Like, for instance, was it 96, I think it was, when, and I'm going to go a little bit further down, but still that's the Raptors. I believe they drafted, I think it was Marcus Camby, right? And then, of course, in 92, the Orlando Magic, they drafted Shaquille O'Neal. In 1989, I think it was, the Miami Heat drafted Glenn Rice. I think it might have been 92. Miami drafted, what's his name? Start off as a point guard, wound up being a power forward. Steve Smith. So you get where I'm going with this, right? So same thing with, Kevin Garnett. That's the main thing I'm thinking about in my head. All these players that were lost in expansion or were drafted by these players, they would have gone to other teams. So we would have seen a lot more, quote unquote, super teams, more than likely in the NBA. Now you can make an argument. Well, what if they went to teams that already had established talent and that would have delayed their development? Not those guys. Those types of talents, those types of players, they would have made room for the development as far as their overall talent. So that's why I always make this argument about when people say, oh, the 1960s wasn't very competitive. Yes, it was, because you only had, at times, 8 to 14 teams. But almost every team had a superstar. So there was no nights off. It wasn't like you looked at the roster of a team in the 60s for the most part and said, oh, okay, we're going to have an easy night. Yeah, maybe you could say that for the Chicago Packers. And maybe you could say that for a couple of years with the New York Knicks in the early 60s. But that's about it. Every other team that you played, you had to go out there and play hard. You know what I'm saying? So that's one thing that I think about when it comes to expansion. If there were no expansion drafts, is that the talent would have been less diluted and you would have had a better brand of basketball. Another thing I think that would have happened, I guess, because the talent would have been less dispersed across the NBA, is that you're not going to see a whole bunch of 65 win teams, 60 win teams. You're not going to see a lot of that. A great record, I think, in the NBA would have, especially after the Showtime era, I think would have been 60 tops. I mean, when you really look at it, if you look at the 1980s, I mean, what was the highest win total that decade? 67 by the Boston Celtics. And I think the most wins that the Lakers had, and that's with a Western Conference that wasn't as competitive as the Eastern Conference. Showtime, I think the most wins they had in the season was 65. So with no expansion, I don't see the Bulls winning 72 games in 1996. And that's not a knock on them. It's just that and I've said this before, I freely admit that in the second half of the 90s, the NBA did become somewhat watered down. Even Michael Jordan and the Bulls admitted that. But that didn't mean that the game was easy. Um, the actual NBA games were still hard fought, but it wasn't as talented a league as it had been before expansion. And they admitted that. And every time that you have these expansion drafts, it does dilute the talent pool. Now, there was still so much talent in the NBA coming into the league in the mid to late '80s, early '90s that it kind of offset the drafts in the late '80s. But when you started having a lot more NBA busts, starting in the mid '90s, um, when you started seeing a lot of great players retiring. When you think about it, man, how many players did we have that were supposed to be the future of the league? Like Roy Tarpley. Think about this for a second. Roy Tarpley. Well, I shouldn't say future, but guys who look like they could be stars, and some guys who were supposed to be great players going into the future. Think about this: Roy Tarpley, Michael Ray Richardson. Bernard King's career was cut short by injury. Um, of course, we know what happened with Len Bias, Reggie Lewis, right? Drazen Petrovic, Bobby Hurley, right? Um, we had guys who were great collegiate players, but they didn't pan out as far as their potential when it came to the NBA. Christian Laettner. Like I said, we started seeing a lot more NBA bust, especially in the late '90s, and I think that contributed to more of the talent being diluted in the NBA. You know what I'm saying? So, man, I mean, that's kind of what I see. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just think that the NBA would have been a lot more competitive. There would have been a lot more parity, um, similar to what we saw in the '70s. But I think we would have had, like I said, like a lot of teams with, if not superstars, teams that had a lot of great veteran talent. And like I said before, with what, 6 fewer NBA franchises? What is that? What is that? 12? What are we talking about here? 70 NBA players potentially with maybe 4 or 5 stars dispersed across the NBA, good role players. Yeah, that would have really pumped up the league as far as the quality of basketball and the stars. But I also tend to think too that would have been a killer when it comes to how how they're what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to figure out how that would work though if you have all these stars. Wouldn't they be making more money? And would the average payroll be substantially different than what we see in today's NBA or in the NBA in the '90s? Because if you have, say, a standard payroll where 1 year, let's go back in time to like 1995, right, when your best player back then may be making $15 million a year, right? And then the second best may be making like 10, and then some guy making 7, and then 3, and then everybody else is like pump somewhere between the 1.5 to 300,000 range, right? Okay, if you got a team with three superstars, one is making 15, one making 4, especially after the rookie deal. One making 15, one making 14, one making 13. I mean, how does that work? Is the CBA different in this situation? I'm assuming they're going to have a larger budget in this scenario, right? More money to work with. If you got a smaller league, that's more money as far as in the pot. So, I mean, that's kind of how I look at this thing, man. You know what I'm saying? I hope I'm not rambling too much. There's just so many different things you got to think about. So I think that the teams would have more money in the pot, fewer players, fewer teams, but more money and more players as far as quality of players, you know what I'm saying? And the NBA product will be better. And that's kind of what I see. But it kind of doesn't make sense, though, because usually when a league is thriving, that's when you see expansion. So, for whatever reason, if the NBA didn't have expansion, that's what I think would have happened, I guess. But tell me what you guys think.